Hey guys, settle here. Tonight we began Roman dinner parties that were basically psychological warfare, but before we get started, make sure that you subscribed and comment me where are you watching from. In ancient Rome, dinner was never a casual act. It was not an opportunity to relax. It was not a reward at the end of the day. It was not even primarily about eating. A Roman dinner was a test, a performance, a slow and deliberate sorting mechanism that revealed exactly where you stood in society and reminded you, quietly but firmly, that you knew your place. The Romans ate to survive, like everyone else. But when they gathered to dine together, especially in formal settings, food became secondary. What mattered was position. What mattered was who reclined where, who was invited at all, who served whom, and who was forced to watch others eat better food than they would ever touch. The table was not neutral ground. It was a controlled environment where hierarchy was reinforced without violence, using customs so old that questioning them felt unnatural. A Roman dinner did not begin with hunger. It began with calculation. Invitations were not extended lightly. Being invited to dine at someone's home was not a friendly gesture. It was a signal. It meant you were being assessed, displayed, or used. Sometimes all three. Hosts chose their guests carefully, not for pleasure, but for optics. Who you invited said something about your status. Who you excluded said something even louder. The guest list itself was a hierarchy. Close friends and powerful allies were invited early and often. Lesser acquaintances were included strategically. Clients, dependents, and social inferiors might be invited as an obligation rather than a pleasure. Their presence demonstrated the host's influence. Their discomfort was irrelevant. A Roman host was not expected to make everyone feel welcome. He was expected to make the structure visible. Dinner was usually held in the triclinium, a room specifically designed to make inequality unavoidable. 3 couches were arranged around a low table. Guests reclined rather than sat, propped on one elbow, facing the food and each other. This posture was not about comfort. It was about control. Reclining marked you as civilized. Sitting upright marked you as inferior. Standing marked you as a servant. Not everyone was allowed on the couches. That privilege depended on gender, status, and reputation. Women were sometimes present, sometimes not, depending on the period and the household. Children rarely reclined. Slaves never did. They stood, moved silently, and existed only to facilitate the experience of others. Their presence was constant, their humanity largely ignored. Where you reclined mattered more than what you ate. The placement of bodies in the room followed a strict order that every guest understood instinctively. The most honored position was closest to the host, arranged so that conversation flowed toward power. Lesser guests were placed farther away, physically and socially. Some positions were intentionally uncomfortable. Being assigned to one of them was a message delivered without words. No one announced these rankings. They were enforced through tradition, memory, and fear of embarrassment. A guest who challenged their placement risked social death. A guest who misunderstood their importance revealed themselves immediately. Roman society valued clarity. Dinner made clarity unavoidable. The food arrived slowly. This was intentional. A Roman feast unfolded in stages, each course serving a different purpose. The early dishes were light, almost deceptive. Fruits, eggs, simple breads. This was not generosity. This was patience. The host was setting the pace, demonstrating control over time itself. No one ate until allowed. No one rushed. Hunger was endured quietly. Wine was diluted with water. Drinking it undiluted marked you as a barbarian. The ratio of wine to water was chosen by the host or a designated master of the feast. This person controlled intoxication. Too much sobriety made a guest seem stiff and ungrateful. Too much drunkenness made them reckless. Both were dangerous. Balance was enforced from above. Conversation was expected, but not freely. Topics were chosen carefully. Politics was dangerous. Personal ambition was risky. Philosophy was acceptable if delivered modestly. Humor was allowed, but never at the host's expense. Silence was safer than saying the wrong thing. Many guests spoke only when spoken to, offering agreement rather than opinion. Laughter was monitored. Excessive enthusiasm suggested desperation. Too little suggested disdain. A guest who laughed at the wrong moment revealed poor judgment. A guest who failed to laugh at all appeared ungrateful. Roman dinners trained people to regulate their emotions in public with precision. As the meal progressed, differences in food quality became obvious. This was not accidental. The best cuts, rare spices, and elaborate dishes were reserved for those closest to the host. Others received simpler fare. Sometimes this difference was extreme. High-status guests ate exotic meats while lower-status guests were served leftovers or cheap staples. Everyone noticed. No one commented. That was the point. A Roman host who served everyone equally would have been considered strange, possibly dangerous. Equality blurred boundaries. Boundaries protected order. Dinner existed to reinforce those boundaries through repetition. Some hosts deliberately humiliated their guests. They served inferior wine to certain people. They delayed food. They offered mock delicacies designed to look impressive but taste bland. This behavior was not considered rude. It was considered a reminder. If you accepted the invitation, you accepted the treatment. Guests endured this quietly because refusing an invitation could be worse. Declining dinner suggested independence. Independence suggested ingratitude. Ingratitude damaged relationships that mattered for survival. Roman society ran on obligation, not comfort. Slaves moved constantly during the meal. They carried dishes, poured wine, cleaned spills, and absorbed abuse without reaction. A well-run household trained its slaves to appear invisible. Their silence was a sign of wealth. A noisy slave suggested disorder. Disorder reflected badly on the host. Mistakes were punished immediately. A dropped dish, a spilled cup, a delayed response could result in violence after the guests left. Everyone in the room understood this. The calm atmosphere rested on unspoken threat. As the courses continued, the food became heavier, richer, more excessive. This was where the spectacle peaked. Rare ingredients imported at great cost appeared on the table. Dishes were arranged to impress the eye before the stomach. Peacocks, dormice, fish shaped into mythical creatures. This was not about taste. It was about proof. Proof that the host could afford waste. Eating too eagerly was dangerous. It suggested hunger. Hunger suggested need. Need suggested weakness. A proper Roman guest ate slowly, even when the food was exceptional. Desire was disguised as restraint. Eventually, the meal ended, not when everyone was full, but when the host decided the display was complete. Dessert appeared, often symbolic rather than satisfying. Fruit, nuts, honeyed pastries. A final demonstration of abundance before withdrawal, guests departed carefully. Gratitude was expressed without excess. Praise was offered without flattery. Everything was calibrated. The dinner ended, but its consequences did not. Every interaction would be remembered. Every reaction would be noted. Future invitations would depend on tonight's performance. A Roman dinner was never just one evening. It was part of a long record, a social ledger maintained in memory. You were judged not by what you said, but by how well you endured the structure without disrupting it. In this way, Roman feasts achieved their purpose. They fed the body just enough, while feeding the system completely. As Roman dinners continued deeper into the night, the focus shifted further away from nourishment and more firmly into endurance. By this point, hunger was no longer the problem. Fatigue was. The couches that once seemed indulgent became uncomfortable. Elbows ached. Bodies stiffened. Leaving early was unacceptable. Staying alert was mandatory. A guest who appeared tired insulted the host. A guest who fell asleep insulted everyone. Time itself became a weapon. Roman elites had the luxury of stretching an evening far beyond necessity. To keep guests awake and compliant was a demonstration of dominance. Those who could endure proved they belonged. Those who struggled revealed limits they would later regret exposing. Wine continued to circulate, always controlled, always measured. Its purpose was not pleasure. It was loosening. A slightly relaxed guest was easier to read. A guest who spoke a little too freely exposed alliances, fears, ambitions. Hosts remembered these details. Roman memory was long and unforgiving. Entertainment was sometimes introduced, but never casually. Musicians, dancers, poets, acrobats. Their presence was not meant to delight the guests so much as remind them that the host could command attention at will. Applause was expected. Too much enthusiasm suggested desperation. Too little suggested arrogance. Every reaction was another test quietly passed or failed. Some performances were deliberately uncomfortable. Strange acts. Awkward humor. Displays that hovered between impressive and unsettling. This discomfort was intentional. A guest who endured without visible reaction demonstrated discipline. A guest who shifted, grimaced, or looked away revealed weakness. The slaves who performed these entertainments were objects in every sense. Their skill reflected well on the host. Their suffering was irrelevant. Roman luxury depended on distance, emotional and physical. To care openly would have disrupted the atmosphere. Compassion was private. Dinner was public. As the evening progressed, conversation grew less structured. This did not mean safer. On the contrary, the later hours were when damage was done. Tongues loosened. Old grudges surfaced indirectly. Compliments carried sharp edges. Insults were delivered softly enough to deny intent. Roman elites were masters of indirect aggression. A raised eyebrow. A delayed response. A comment delivered too late to be challenged. Dinner provided the perfect environment for this behavior. Everyone was trapped together, reclining, listening, remembering. Certain guests were invited specifically to be humiliated. A social inferior placed among superiors. A rival seated too far from the host. A former ally served inferior wine. These choices were calculated. Public humiliation delivered quietly was more effective than open confrontation. To protest would have been unthinkable. To notice without reacting was survival. Women present at these dinners navigated a separate but equally strict terrain. Their behavior reflected not only on themselves but on their families. Silence was safer than wit. Modesty was required even in spaces saturated with crude symbolism. Their presence was tolerated, sometimes valued, but always scrutinized. Marriage alliances were reinforced at these tables. Reputations were built or damaged. A single evening could determine future support, inheritance disputes, or political backing. Dinner was never isolated from consequence. At some point, food stopped arriving altogether. The table was cleared, not because the evening was ending, but because the focus had fully shifted. Now came drinking games, philosophical displays, memory contests, recitations. These were not games. They were demonstrations of education and restraint. A guest who could quote poetry without stumbling proved upbringing. A guest who failed revealed gaps that could never be erased. Roman society remembered embarrassment longer than kindness. Vomiting was common. It was neither encouraged nor condemned. It was managed. Slaves stood ready to assist, clean, and pretend nothing had happened. A guest who lost control too visibly risked ridicule later. A guest who recovered quickly earned quiet respect. Excess was admired only when controlled. Losing control was forgivable once. Repeating it was fatal. Eventually, exhaustion overtook obligation. Guests were allowed to leave, one by one, not when they wished, but when the host decided enough had been extracted. Departures were polite, measured, and careful. Nothing careless was said. Everything dangerous had already happened. Afterward, stories circulated. Interpretations hardened. That dinner would be referenced indirectly for years. A favor granted later would trace back to something said while reclining. A refusal would echo a slight delivered over wine. Roman dinners were not memories. They were records. The following morning, households returned to routine. Slaves bore the marks of the previous night. Floors were cleaned. Dishes repaired or replaced. The elite slept late. No one reflected on morality. Only outcomes mattered. For those who attended, the dinner lingered. They replayed moments privately, analyzing tone, timing, posture. Regret was common. Correction was impossible. Roman society did not allow rewrites. And this cycle repeated endlessly. Invitation. Endurance. Judgment. Memory. That I end this way. Roman feasts maintained the social order more efficiently than laws. Laws could be challenged. Customs could not. Dinner enforced compliance through repetition, familiarity, and fear of exclusion. To be excluded entirely was worse than humiliation. An invitation meant relevance. No invitation meant invisibility. Roman elites would endure almost anything to avoid that fate. So they reclined. They smiled. They endured discomfort quietly. They learned to eat slowly, speak carefully, and remember everything. The food was never the point. Over time, the Roman dinner evolved into something more precise, more refined, and more dangerous. What began as an open display of hierarchy slowly became a subtler instrument. The rules remained the same, but their enforcement grew quieter. By the height of the empire, a skilled host no longer needed excess to demonstrate power. Restraint itself became a signal. A modest feast hosted by the right person carried more weight than an extravagant one hosted by the wrong person. Guests noticed this immediately. Simplicity, when paired with confidence, was intimidating. It suggested that the host had nothing to prove. That suggestion lingered long after the meal ended. At these dinners, memory was currency. Romans valued recall not as nostalgia, but as leverage. Who remembered a favor? Who remembered a slight? Who remembered where they were seated 10 years ago and why? Forgetting was not innocence. Forgetting was negligence. Guests learned quickly that dinners were not isolated events. They were chapters in a long narrative that never stopped being written. Each appearance adjusted your standing slightly. Up or down. Forward or backward. Rarely still. As the empire expanded, the guest lists grew more diverse. Senators reclined beside generals. Wealthy merchants appeared among old families. New money sat uncomfortably close to ancient names. This proximity created tension. Dinner became the place where that tension was managed without open conflict. Old families used tradition as a weapon. They followed the rules perfectly, forcing newcomers to reveal their unfamiliarity. A misplaced compliment. An incorrect reference. A misunderstanding of ritual. Each error confirmed what everyone already suspected. That wealth could not buy belonging. New families relied on excess. They brought rare foods, elaborate entertainments, foreign luxuries. Sometimes this worked. More often, it exposed insecurity. Roman elites distrusted enthusiasm. Calm confidence was harder to fake. The servants observed all of this from the edges of the room. They learned which guests mattered by how they were treated. They learned which ones could be ignored. A household ran smoothly because slaves understood hierarchy as well as their masters. Often better. Punishments after dinner were quiet and efficient. A slave who embarrassed the household was removed. A servant who overheard too much was reassigned. Silence was maintained not by loyalty, but by fear and routine. As the evening wore on, bodily discomfort increased. The reclining position, elegant in theory, was taxing in practice. Digestion slowed. Limbs went numb. The body became heavy. These sensations were endured without complaint. Complaining would have suggested fragility. Roman ideals prized endurance. Not the dramatic kind, but the silent kind. Enduring boredom. Enduring discomfort. Enduring humiliation without reaction. Dinner was training for public life. By midnight, the room often smelled of oil lamps, wine, and human fatigue. Smoke hung in the air. Voices grew softer. Faces slackened. Yet the performance continued. Leaving before dismissal was an insult. Staying required discipline. Some guests learned to disappear while still present. They reclined, nodded, spoke when addressed, and withdrew inward. This skill was admired. To occupy space without demanding attention was a mark of maturity. Roman power did not need noise, others failed. They spoke too much. They gestured too broadly. They laughed too freely. These guests were remembered. Not kindly. In later centuries, philosophers criticized these dinners as decadent. Moralists condemned excess. Satirists mocked the rituals. None of this changed anything. The system endured because it worked. It sorted people efficiently. Even emperors participated. Imperial dinners were the most dangerous of all. Every guest knew that one wrong expression could be fatal. Silence became survival. Compliments were calculated to the word. Fear replaced etiquette, but the structure remained. An emperor who dined casually terrified his guests more than one who followed tradition. Predictability was safety. Roman culture trusted rules because rules limited surprise. After such dinners, guests returned home changed in small ways. Some felt elevated. Others diminished. Most felt exhausted. Sleep came slowly. Thoughts replayed endlessly. Regret surfaced quietly. The next invitation, when it arrived, was read carefully. Who was hosting? Who might attend? What it implied? Acceptance was weighed against risk. Declining required justification. Roman life did not allow neutrality. Over decades, these dinners shaped personalities. People learned to suppress reaction. To mask emotion. To speak indirectly. Roman social life rewarded control above all else. This discipline extended beyond the table. In courts. In politics. In family life. The habits learned while reclining carried into every interaction. A society trained itself nightly. The food continued to matter less and less. Eventually, it was almost irrelevant. Bread and olives could carry the same weight as peacock and spice, if served in the right context. What endured was the structure. Invitation. Placement. Endurance. Judgment. Memory. A Roman dinner did not end when the guests left. It ended when its effects were no longer useful. Which was rarely. And so, night after night, across centuries, the ritual repeated. Quietly. Efficiently. Without mercy. As these dinners repeated across years, patterns hardened into instinct. People no longer thought about the rules. They felt them. A Roman guest could enter a dining room and understand the hierarchy within moments, without a word spoken. The placement of couches, the quality of lamps, the number of slaves present, even the silence itself communicated meaning. Silence, especially, carried weight. A quiet dinner did not mean comfort. It meant caution. It meant everyone present understood that attention was dangerous. In rooms where power concentrated, noise diminished. The most important gatherings were often the calmest. Food, when it arrived, followed expectation rather than novelty. Surprise was risky. A surprising dish could offend tradition. Tradition was safer than creativity. A host who experimented too much signaled instability. Roman society valued repetition because repetition made outcomes predictable. Guests learned to read the host's mood through small signals. The pace of wine pouring. The frequency of servants passing. The choice of entertainment or lack of it. These cues mattered. Misreading them had consequences later, rarely immediate, but always real. Over time, certain families became known for particular styles of dinner. Some were severe and minimal. Others indulgent but controlled. Reputation spread quietly. Invitations carried assumptions. Guests adjusted behavior accordingly. These reputations could last generations. A household remembered as generous attracted loyalty. One remembered as cruel attracted fear. Both could be effective. Indifference was the only failure. Roman moralists liked to pretend that virtue governed these spaces. It did not. Utility did. A dinner was successful if it reinforced relationships that mattered and weakened those that did not. Everything else was decoration. As the empire aged, anxiety crept into these rituals. The guest lists grew longer. The power structures more complex. The fear of saying the wrong thing increased. Dinners became quieter, heavier, more cautious. The joy that once existed at the edges faded. People reclined longer without speaking. Wine was diluted further. Entertainment shortened. No one wanted to stand out. Standing out attracted attention. Attention attracted danger. Slaves adapted to this shift instinctively. They moved more quietly. They anticipated needs more precisely. A well-run household felt almost still. Movement happened without sound. This silence was admired. In such rooms, time felt suspended. Lamps burned low. Shadows stretched. Faces became masks. The dinner could have lasted an hour or 6. No one checked. Timekeeping was irrelevant when leaving was not an option. Guests learned to control their bodies. They suppressed coughs. They ignored cramps. They maintained posture long past comfort. The body became another thing to manage, like speech or expression. This discipline was praised indirectly. A guest who endured without visible strain earned respect. A guest who shifted too often earned suspicion. Physical discomfort revealed character. As generations passed, fewer people remembered why these customs existed. They only knew that deviation felt dangerous. Tradition persisted not because it was understood, but because it was feared. Occasionally, someone broke the pattern. A host served equal portions to all guests. A guest spoke freely. A dinner ended early. These moments were noticed immediately. They were discussed later with unease. Sometimes such changes signaled new power. Sometimes they signaled decline. Roman society struggled to tell the difference until it was too late. When civil wars loomed, dinners grew smaller. Trust narrowed. Invitations became rare and meaningful. To be invited during uncertain times was both an honor and a risk. Attendance implied alignment. Even in fear, the ritual held. Couches were arranged. Wine diluted. Silence maintained. The structure persisted because it offered familiarity in chaos. When everything else felt unstable, dinner felt known. This, more than luxury, was its true function. In quieter households, far from the capital, simpler versions of these dinners occurred. The structure remained, stripped of excess. Even modest families reproduced the hierarchy in miniature. A head seat. Better portions. Controlled conversation. The system scaled effortlessly. It did not require wealth. It required belief. Children observed these dinners from the edges. They learned early when to speak, when to remain silent, how to watch without being seen. Education began at the table, long before formal instruction. By adulthood, the behavior was automatic. No one needed to explain it. The body knew what to do. This is why Roman social order lasted as long as it did. It was practiced nightly. Reinforced gently. Enforced quietly. Learned by repetition rather than law. The dinner was not an event. It was maintenance. And maintenance, done consistently, rarely draws attention. As centuries passed, the Roman dinner absorbed the weight of habit. What had once required attention now ran on instinct. The ritual no longer needed explanation. It existed as a shared understanding, maintained not by instruction but by quiet correction. A raised eyebrow replaced a rule. A pause replaced a warning. Guests became increasingly skilled at self-erasure. They learned how to be present without leaving a trace. How to agree without committing. How to praise without elevating. This skill was not admired openly, but it was rewarded. Those who mastered it survived longer in Roman public life. The room itself did much of the work. Architecture enforced behavior. Low ceilings encouraged softness of voice. Dim lighting softened expressions. Narrow entrances slowed movement. The space shaped the body before the mind had time to resist. Nothing in the dining room was accidental. The placement of lamps determined who was seen clearly and who remained in shadow. The table's height determined posture. The distance between couches determined intimacy or isolation. Every object participated. Even absence mattered. A missing guest was noticed immediately. Questions formed silently. Explanations were constructed later. Absence suggested illness, disfavor, or worse. To be absent without reason was to invite speculation. Speculation was dangerous. Roman society fed on it. As dinners became more cautious, humor thinned. Jokes, once common, became riskier. Irony could be misread. Wit could offend. Laughter drew attention. Attention was no longer desirable. Silence became the safest contribution. This did not mean dinners were peaceful. Tension remained, compressed rather than released. It gathered in posture, in glances, in the careful delay before responding. Conflict did not disappear. It simply became quieter. Slaves sensed this shift as well. They learned to anticipate needs without being signaled. A cup was refilled before it was noticed. A spill cleaned before anyone reacted. Their invisibility became complete. When a household functioned perfectly, it seemed to operate without people. This perfection was admired. It suggested control extending beyond human effort, as if the house itself obeyed. Guests judged hosts on this standard. A smooth dinner reflected discipline. A single disruption suggested weakness. Weakness invited pressure. As Roman power centralized, dinners near authority became more dangerous. Proximity to power increased stakes. Words carried more weight. Silence carried even more. The closer one dined to influence, the less one spoke. At the highest levels, dinner became almost monastic. Movement slowed. Voices dropped. Wine was symbolic rather than intoxicating. The ritual stripped itself down to essentials. Those essentials were endurance and memory. Guests remembered who spoke and who did not. Who smiled and who remained neutral. Who appeared relaxed and who appeared strained. These impressions mattered long after the table was cleared. The following days often revealed the dinner's purpose. A favor granted. A request denied. A promotion delayed. A letter unanswered. The connection was never stated, but it was understood. Roman society preferred cause and effect without explanation. Explanation invited argument. Silence preserved authority. Over time, people stopped expecting fairness. They expected consistency. Consistency was easier to survive. If you knew the rules, you could navigate them. If the rules changed, no one was safe. Dinners reinforced this consistency nightly. They reminded everyone that position mattered more than intention. That perception mattered more than truth. That control mattered more than comfort. In private, individuals felt the strain. Exhaustion accumulated. Resentment grew. But private feelings had no outlet. Public life allowed no release. So the ritual continued, absorbing pressure without breaking. When Rome began to weaken, dinners did not change immediately. The structure remained intact long after belief faded. People followed customs they no longer trusted because abandoning them felt more dangerous than continuing. Even as resources thinned, hierarchy remained. Portions shrank unevenly. Luxury faded selectively. The system adapted. It always did. A Roman dinner near the end of the empire looked quieter, poorer, and more anxious, but it followed the same shape. Invitation. Placement. Endurance. Judgment. Memory. This shape outlived emperors. It outlived victories. It outlived belief. Because it was never about pleasure. It was about order. As the empire stretched thinner, dinners grew smaller, but no less controlled. Fewer guests meant fewer witnesses, and fewer witnesses meant higher risk. In intimate settings, every movement mattered more. A single misplaced expression could not disappear into a crowd. It lingered. Hosts became more cautious. Invitations were extended slowly, deliberately. Familiar faces were safer than ambitious ones. Loyalty mattered more than brilliance. At the table, predictability became a form of protection. The food reflected this shift. Extravagance gave way to symbolism. A rare ingredient no longer proved wealth. It proved access. Knowing where something came from mattered more than how impressive it looked. Supply chains became status markers. Scarcity itself became power. Guests noticed these details immediately. They learned to read meals like documents. A dish served out of season suggested connections. A simple plate served confidently suggested stability. Nothing was neutral. Conversation narrowed further. Topics circled around safe ground. Family history. Shared memories. Carefully curated anecdotes that revealed nothing new. The past was safer than the present. The present was safer than the future. In these quieter dinners, endurance became psychological rather than physical. Guests endured boredom, repetition, restraint. They endured their own thoughts. Silence forced inward attention. Many found this uncomfortable. Roman culture did not value introspection. It valued performance. A dinner that demanded internal stillness felt heavier than one filled with noise. Slaves adapted again. Their movements slowed further. They became shadows. The best households trained servants to predict needs before awareness formed. This anticipation created the illusion that the guests required nothing. The illusion was admired. As external pressures mounted, rumors infiltrated the dining room. Wars. Taxes. Instability. These were not discussed directly. They appeared as pauses, as tightened expressions, as careful omissions. Everyone sensed them. No one named them. A dinner where too much went unsaid was more dangerous than one where too much was spoken. Guests learned to monitor themselves constantly. Not just words, but breathing, posture, tempo. Control extended inward. The body became another surface to manage. This constant regulation exhausted people slowly. There was no release. No dramatic collapse. Just accumulation. The ritual demanded presence without expression. Over years, this reshaped personalities. People became guarded. Reserved. Skilled at withholding. Roman calm was not peace. It was compression. Children raised in these households absorbed the atmosphere instinctively. They learned that silence meant safety. That attention was dangerous. That visibility carried risk. By adulthood, this felt natural. Thus, even as institutions weakened, behavior remained stable. The dinner preserved a way of being long after belief faded. In the final centuries, some dinners felt hollow. The structure remained, but conviction thinned. Guests followed rules without faith. Ritual without belief is fragile, but it can persist surprisingly long. People continued to recline. To dilute wine. To measure words. To judge silently. Because abandoning the ritual would have required confronting uncertainty. Uncertainty was worse than discomfort. So the dinners continued. Smaller. Quieter. More anxious. Still recognizable, they ended not with a final collapse, but with gradual forgetting. Fewer invitations. Less expectation. More isolation. The ritual faded as people stopped gathering, not because they rejected it, but because they no longer could sustain it. Yet its influence lingered. Long after the couches disappeared, the habits remained. Control. Indirectness. Emotional restraint. Social calculation. These habits traveled forward in time, reshaped, renamed, but familiar. They appeared in courts, salons, boardrooms. Different furniture. Same structure. Because the Roman dinner was never just a meal. It was a method. A way of teaching people how to exist within hierarchy without open force. And methods, once learned, are difficult to unlearn. Long after the physical spaces of Roman dining vanished, the internal habits they created continued to function. People still carried themselves as if reclining among others, measuring presence, regulating expression, calculating consequence. The room had disappeared, but the posture remained. This endurance of behavior explains why Roman social customs were so difficult to dismantle. They were not enforced loudly. They were rehearsed quietly. Night after night. Meal after meal. Through repetition rather than command. When later societies inherited fragments of Roman life, they inherited these habits too. The suspicion of enthusiasm. The preference for restraint. The belief that authority should feel calm, distant, and unmoved. These traits did not require explanation. They felt natural to those who practiced them. Even in decline, Romans trusted routine. They believed that maintaining form could delay collapse. The dinner, in its quiet way, became an anchor. As borders failed and politics fractured, familiar rituals offered a sense of continuity. To recline as one always had was to pretend that order still existed. Guests clung to this illusion. They behaved as if the structure still protected them. As if correct posture could replace stability. As if silence could stop change. In many ways, it did, briefly. Dinners slowed transformation. They absorbed anxiety and redistributed it quietly. They allowed people to feel that something remained under control. That the world still obeyed recognizable rules. But control without substance eventually becomes hollow. As resources dwindled, hosts could no longer maintain the illusion. Slaves grew fewer. Lamps burned lower. Food grew simpler. The room revealed its fragility. When the structure could no longer be supported materially, its authority weakened. Yet even then, behavior lagged behind reality. Guests continued to act as though the old rules applied. They endured discomfort without reward. They measured words that no longer mattered. They waited for judgments that never came. The dinner lost its audience. What remained was habit without purpose. Eventually, gatherings stopped altogether. Not dramatically. Quietly. Invitations ceased. People stayed home. The ritual faded not through rebellion, but through neglect. Still, its influence lingered in how people related to one another. In how power was performed. In how silence was valued over speech. In how discomfort was normalized. The Roman dinner taught generations that survival depended on control. On reading rooms. On enduring without complaint. These lessons proved adaptable. They outlived the empire itself. Because they did not belong to buildings or furniture. They belonged to people. And people carried them forward, reshaping them to fit new contexts. New hierarchies. New rooms. The form changed. The function did not. In this way, the Roman dinner never truly ended. It dissolved into everyday life. Into offices, councils, courts. Into any space where people gathered and power needed to be felt without being named. The food was always incidental, what mattered was who controlled the pace. Who set the tone. Who endured longest without revealing strain. These were the skills Rome taught best. Quietly. Relentlessly, what made the Roman dinner so effective was not cruelty, but predictability. Cruelty can provoke resistance. Predictability creates adaptation. People learn to bend themselves to fit a shape that never changes. Over time, the shape feels natural. Eventually, it feels necessary. Guests did not attend these dinners expecting enjoyment. They attended expecting evaluation. The body prepared accordingly. Shoulders lowered. Breath slowed. Expression narrowed. This preparation became automatic, a physical response to social proximity. Roman society rarely announced expectations. It relied on embarrassment to teach. A single visible mistake corrected a lifetime of confidence. No punishment was required. Memory did the work. This is why newcomers struggled. They had not yet been trained by repetition. They reacted too quickly. They spoke too openly. They misread pauses. Each error marked them as inexperienced. Experience, not intelligence, determined survival. The dinner rewarded those who learned to wait. To delay reaction. To observe before acting. These skills translated directly into political life. The table was rehearsal for the forum. Over time, Roman identity became inseparable from this restraint. To be Roman was to endure calmly. To appear unmoved. To let others reveal themselves first. The dinner taught this nightly. Even pleasure was regulated. Enjoyment had to be visible but controlled. Too much delight appeared desperate. Too little appeared dismissive. Guests learned to express satisfaction without enthusiasm. This emotional narrowing shaped the culture deeply. When Roman writers praised moderation, they were not describing morality. They were describing survival strategy. As power structures grew more fragile, the pressure at dinners increased. People became more cautious, not less. When certainty disappears, ritual tightens. Form replaces substance. Correctness replaces conviction. Dinners in this period felt heavier. Guests arrived already tired. The atmosphere pressed inward. No one relaxed fully. Even smiles were measured. Hosts sensed this and adjusted. They shortened evenings slightly. Reduced excess. Removed unpredictable elements. Safety lay in repetition. The same foods. The same placements. The same conversations. Novelty, once impressive, became threatening. Slaves felt this shift immediately. Their training emphasized anticipation over responsiveness. They moved before being needed. They disappeared faster. Their labor intensified as visible effort diminished. A perfectly run dinner appeared effortless. Effortlessness was the ultimate sign of power. Guests noticed. They always noticed. As generations passed, fewer people remembered a time when dinners felt different. The ritual lost contrast. It simply was. Like weather. Like gravity. Children raised within it did not question it. They adapted. They learned early how to sit still. How to wait. How to speak carefully. Emotional containment became second nature. This emotional containment had consequences. Roman society produced individuals skilled at endurance but limited in intimacy. Feelings were private, unshared, compressed. The dinner did not create this trait alone, but it reinforced it relentlessly. When people did feel strongly, the feelings often emerged elsewhere. In private excess. In sudden cruelty. In withdrawal. The public space allowed no release. The dinner absorbed pressure until it could not. Yet even then, it rarely broke dramatically. It simply thinned. Fewer guests. Shorter evenings. Less expectation. Still, the habits remained. People continued to manage themselves as if being watched. As if judged. As if remembered. Because for centuries, they had been. And memory, once internalized, does not require witnesses. The most revealing aspect of the Roman dinner was not what happened, but what never happened. No one spoke directly about fear. No one acknowledged tension. Silence absorbed everything. Silence was not absence, it was containment. This containment shaped time itself. Evenings did not feel long or short. They felt suspended. Guests lost track of duration because nothing marked progress. Courses arrived without announcement. Conversations drifted without conclusion. The night unfolded as a single, unbroken surface. This was intentional. Measured time invites impatience. Unmeasured time produces compliance. People learned not to ask when something would end. Asking implied expectation. Expectation implied entitlement. Entitlement was dangerous. Instead, they waited. Waiting became a skill. A virtue. A signal of maturity. Those who waited well were trusted. Those who fidgeted, glanced, shifted, were not. The body was trained before the mind. Children learned posture before rhetoric. Stillness before speech. These lessons were not formal. They were absorbed. Corrected through looks, pauses, absences. No one said, "Be still." Stillness was rewarded with inclusion. The dinner table was where inclusion was granted or withdrawn. Invitations mattered more than outcomes. Being present signaled relevance. Absence suggested decline. This created a subtle competition. Not for dominance, but for continuity. To remain invited was to remain real. As political structures expanded, dinners became smaller but more significant. Fewer people meant higher stakes. Each seat carried weight. Each placement suggested alignment. Guests learned to read seating the way others read documents. Distance from the host. Proximity to power. Direction of attention. Everything communicated. Nothing was accidental. Wine softened the edges but never dissolved them. Drunkenness was tolerated only if controlled. Losing control was interpreted as moral weakness, not excess. Excess could be admired. Weakness could not. This distinction mattered deeply. Men drank to demonstrate capacity, not escape. Women drank less visibly, but were judged more harshly for it. The dinner enforced gender through expectation rather than rule. Slaves poured carefully. The amount in a cup could alter an evening. Too little insulted. Too much tested restraint. They learned each guest's threshold. Memory was survival. Mistakes were remembered long after forgiveness was offered. The host watched everything without appearing to watch. Power expressed itself through apparent ease. The more effortless the host seemed, the more absolute their control. Guests responded by mirroring that ease. Even discomfort was disguised as calm. This mutual performance created an illusion of harmony. The illusion was more important than truth. Over time, people began to experience their own emotions as disruptions. Feelings that could not be contained felt inappropriate. Shame followed intensity. Pride followed restraint. This psychological shaping extended far beyond the dinner. It influenced how Romans governed, fought, negotiated, and remembered. Public grief was limited. Public joy was restrained. Extremes were suspect. The dinner trained people to exist within narrow emotional boundaries. Stability depended on it. But boundaries compress pressure. And pressure seeks release. When release came, it often arrived indirectly. Through satire. Through rumor. Through sudden acts that seemed uncharacteristic. These were not contradictions. They were consequences. The dinner did not fail. It succeeded too well. As centuries passed, the ritual became less conscious. People stopped thinking of it as training. It was simply tradition. Custom. The way things were done. And when traditions stop being examined, they become invisible. Invisible structures are the strongest ones. They do not argue. They do not justify themselves. They persist, even as Rome changed, even as power shifted, even as wealth redistributed, the dinner endured. Adjusted, simplified, repeated. It was portable. It followed Romans wherever they settled. The form traveled even when the meaning thinned. Because the form was enough. People who grew up within it could not imagine another way of gathering. Other cultures seemed noisy. Excessive. Unsafe. The Roman dinner produced a specific kind of person. Controlled. Observant. Enduring. Reserved. And once produced, that person reproduced the system without instruction. This is how rituals survive empires. Not by force. By habit. As the dinner ritual spread and stabilized, it began to shape not only behavior but perception. Romans did not merely act restrained, they saw the world through restraint. Events were interpreted in terms of control, balance, and endurance. Anything that resisted these frames appeared chaotic, even immoral. Foreign customs were often judged by their tables. Loud feasts suggested instability. Communal eating without hierarchy implied disorder. Eating quickly implied desperation. Eating alone implied mistrust. The Roman dinner became a measuring tool for civilization itself. This perception justified dominance without explicit argument. To rule others felt natural when their habits appeared uncontrolled. Superiority was inferred from posture, not philosophy. Within Rome, class distinctions hardened through repetition. Wealth could buy ingredients, but it could not buy fluency. Fluency required exposure. Years of silent observation. Generations of correction. This is why upward mobility remained limited despite apparent openness. People could enter rooms without understanding how to exist within them. Their discomfort betrayed them. The dinner punished discomfort quietly. No one pointed it out. No one needed to. Exclusion followed naturally. Invitations slowed. Names were forgotten. Presence faded. The most successful guests were those who learned to erase themselves just enough. Not invisible, but unobtrusive. Not passive, but predictable. Predictability was safety. Conversation followed the same pattern. Topics circled without landing. Opinions were suggested, not declared. Disagreement appeared as curiosity rather than opposition. Certainty was dangerous. Certainty attracted attention. Attention invited challenge. So people learned to speak as if thinking aloud, even when rehearsed. To question their own statements. To appear flexible while remaining fixed. This rhetorical habit shaped Roman writing. Even texts carried restraint. Argument was layered. Meaning unfolded slowly. Confidence hid beneath moderation. The dinner trained the voice as much as the body. As time passed, even hosts became constrained by their own authority. Power limited spontaneity. The more one controlled, the less one could deviate. A host who surprised guests risked unsettling the hierarchy they embodied. Thus power became conservative. Not ideological, but procedural. Change threatened balance. Balance sustained control. This conservatism slowed innovation but strengthened continuity. Rome did not adapt quickly, but it endured long. Slaves remained the most perceptive participants. Their survival depended on reading unspoken signals. They understood mood shifts before words changed. They sensed tension before gestures revealed it. This awareness did not grant agency, but it granted accuracy. Accuracy without power produces a particular form of fatigue. Slaves aged faster in memory than in body. They carried hundreds of micro-observations. None of them acknowledged. All of them necessary. When slaves were freed, many struggled in less structured spaces. Freedom removed signals. Without hierarchy, they felt disoriented. The dinner had taught them clarity through constraint. Freedom without structure felt like noise. This paradox reveals the depth of the ritual's influence. It shaped not only those it dominated, but those it oppressed. Even rebellion was imagined within its terms. Dissent took subtle forms. Sarcasm. Delay. Excessive politeness. Refusal to react. Direct confrontation felt crude. Over centuries, this aversion to directness accumulated. Problems were postponed. Tensions layered. Solutions deferred. The dinner did not cause Rome's decline, but it mirrored it. A culture trained to endure rather than resolve eventually exhausts itself. Yet endurance is powerful. It stretches time. It delays collapse. It absorbs shock. Rome absorbed shock for centuries. Long after political coherence weakened, the dinner continued. Smaller. Simpler. Less opulent. But recognizable. People still reclined. Still waited. Still measured themselves against silence. They no longer knew why. That is the mark of a completed ritual. When purpose disappears but behavior remains. Behavior without meaning becomes tradition. Tradition without meaning becomes inertia. And inertia, when strong enough, becomes history. As inertia deepened, the dinner lost its original sharpness but retained its gravity. What once trained alertness now enforced habit. People no longer arrived fully attentive, they arrived prepared to perform familiarity. The danger shifted from making mistakes to appearing out of place. Being out of place became the greatest risk. The dinner no longer tested judgment. It tested belonging. Guests learned the rhythm so well that deviation felt wrong even when harmless. A pause held too long. A response too quick. A laugh too free. These were not crimes, but they unsettled the surface. And the surface mattered more than content. Hosts no longer curated evenings to impress. They curated to reassure. Stability became the product. Repetition became the promise. Dishes repeated across seasons. Seating shifted only slightly. Guests recognized the pattern and relaxed into it. Relaxation did not mean comfort. It meant predictability. Predictability reduces thought. When thought diminishes, ritual strengthens. This shift changed the emotional temperature of gatherings. Earlier dinners were tense with observation. Later ones felt muted. Flat. Less demanding, but also less alive. People spoke because speaking was expected, not because something needed to be said. Silence, once charged, became empty. This emptiness was not noticed immediately. It took generations. Decline rarely announces itself. It feels like easing. People believed life was becoming simpler. Less demanding. Less sharp. In truth, it was becoming thinner. The dinner still marked status, but status itself felt less meaningful. Power existed, but its direction blurred. Authority persisted, but purpose weakened. Guests complied out of habit, not fear. Habit is harder to break than fear. Fear ends when threat disappears. Habit continues even when it no longer serves. As the empire stretched and thinned, regional variations emerged. Some dinners became louder. Others stricter. Some incorporated foreign elements. Others resisted fiercely. Yet all shared the same underlying structure. Hierarchy. Observation. Restraint. This structure outlived Roman political identity. It bled into successor cultures. Medieval courts. Religious refectories. Aristocratic salons. The shape remained. The names changed. Even today, echoes persist. Formal dinners that value composure over connection. Social gatherings where ease is performed, not felt. Silence used to manage rather than listen. These are not direct inheritances. They are convergences. But Rome refined the form early and thoroughly. The Roman dinner demonstrated how power can be embedded in routine. How control can feel like culture. How surveillance can feel like civility. No guards were needed. No rules posted. Everyone enforced it themselves. Self-enforcement is the most efficient form of order. By the final centuries, few remembered that the dinner had once been a proving ground. It was now a relic, still practiced, still respected, but rarely understood. Understanding was unnecessary. Participation was enough. And participation required nothing more than compliance. People complied until compliance became instinct. Instinct does not question. This is why the dinner endured longer than laws. Longer than offices. Longer than borders. Because it lived inside people. When Rome fell, people did not stop dining. They did not stop observing. They did not stop measuring themselves against silence. The empire collapsed outwardly. Inwardly, much remained intact. History often focuses on collapse as an event. But collapse is usually a shedding. Structures fall away, while habits remain. The Roman dinner was such a habit. Quiet. Persistent. Unremarkable. And therefore powerful. The persistence of the Roman dinner reveals a fundamental truth about ritual: its endurance is independent of intention. Once behavior is ingrained, it no longer requires meaning. People continue because they know how to, not because they understand why. The act outlives explanation. Generations learned to manage themselves before they even understood society. Children observed body language, silence, and posture long before they were old enough to grasp hierarchy. By adulthood, these habits were internalized. They became instinct. Reaction replaced thought. Observation replaced judgment. Even in decay, the dinner maintained control over those present. A room could be almost empty, the food sparse, the wine weak, and yet the ritual commanded compliance. Guests assumed positions, controlled expressions, and waited. Waiting alone carried authority. The performance mattered more than the substance. Time itself bent to the ritual. Hours were measured by posture, by the passing of dishes, by the subtle movement of shadows. No one tracked minutes or seconds. The body adjusted, stretching endurance beyond conscious thought. To leave early was unthinkable. To speak freely was dangerous. Slaves became extensions of the ritual. Their awareness sharpened as their autonomy diminished. Every pore, every gesture, every step reinforced the invisible rules. They anticipated needs, corrected small errors before they were perceived, and became invisible operators maintaining the machinery of social order. Their labor was quiet, efficient, unrecorded, but essential. Guests learned the unspoken language of control. Silence was interpreted. Pauses carried weight. Subtle glances transmitted meaning. Even small deviations could ripple outward. Speaking at the wrong moment, laughing too freely, or shifting posture could mark someone as inexperienced, insecure, or dangerous. In this way, the dinner functioned like a mirror. Guests saw themselves through the expectations of others. They were constantly measured, even when alone in thought. Memory became a weapon, every previous misstep lingered, shaping future behavior. Reputation was accumulated in silence, and errors echoed across years. As centuries passed, the dinner became less about immediate survival and more about identity. To participate correctly was to belong. Deviating was not merely a social faux pas, it was existentially uncomfortable. Guests learned to erase personal preference, desire, or spontaneity in favor of collective expectation. Emotional self-regulation became a necessity. Even when the empire's power waned, the dinner endured. Its purpose shifted subtly, from evaluation to reinforcement, from instruction to habit. Now, it functioned less as a proving ground and more as a conservator of identity. Participants acted out continuity. They performed tradition. They maintained boundaries, not because of law, but because habit demanded it. Freedom from hierarchy was almost irrelevant. Habits had become internalized, instinct replaced awareness. People self-regulated as if authority were present, even when it was absent. The ritual had trained generations to behave without oversight. Control had migrated inward. When external crises arrived, wars, invasions, famine, the ritual offered stability. Amid chaos, the predictable rhythm of meals, the silent observation, the subtle enforcement of posture, and the careful spacing of bodies reassured participants. Civilization, in microcosm, persisted at the table even as the empire fell apart elsewhere. Ultimately, the Roman dinner exemplifies the subtle power of ritualized behavior. It demonstrates how repetition can shape thought, how habit can enforce order, how quiet observation can substitute for law, and how endurance becomes culture. The dinner transcended its material setting. It survived buildings, borders, and even political coherence. Even today, remnants persist. Quiet control, careful observation, delayed reactions, moderated expression, and the shaping of presence through ritual are echoes of the same discipline refined at the Roman table. Human behavior, trained by repetition, persists longer than any empire, longer than any law, longer than any monument. The Roman dinner did not end with Rome. It continues, not visibly, not intentionally, but fundamentally. In every controlled gesture, every pause for decorum, every measured interaction, the legacy survives. Power has shifted. Context has changed. But the method remains. Habit outlives authority. It was never about the meal. It was always about the people. And people, trained quietly over centuries, carry rituals forward long after empires crumble. As the centuries unfolded, the dinner shaped perception even more than behavior. People learned to anticipate not only others' reactions but the invisible consequences of their own actions. A glance could be recalled years later. A hesitation could ripple across networks of memory. The ritual functioned as a living archive, recording compliance, missteps, and endurance in ways that no written law could. The body became the first repository of knowledge. A trained guest carried centuries of unspoken instruction in posture, breathing, and gesture. Even alone, standing before a mirror or walking through a street, the learned habits of observation persisted. Self-regulation became instinctive. Impulses were checked before consciousness fully registered them. The mind acted through the body, and the body remembered what the mind had been taught to control. Silence became layered. There was the immediate silence, enforced by proximity and ritual. There was the remembered silence, echoing lessons from previous meals. And there was the anticipatory silence, projecting into future gatherings. These layers reinforced each other. A single meal could influence decades of behavior. Hosts no longer needed to intervene overtly. The table itself taught discipline. Its structure communicated hierarchy, expectation, and consequence. The placement of seats, the sequence of courses, the positioning of lamps and shadows, all became active instructors. Guests learned faster from architecture and timing than from conversation. Even minor disruptions were noted internally, corrected instinctively, and rarely mentioned aloud. This pattern extended beyond dining rooms. Ritualized observation migrated into courts, forums, and public spaces. People who had internalized the rules of the table approached social interaction with the same caution and calculation. The empire may have decayed politically, but the methods of subtle control persisted culturally. Generations of children absorbed this culture early. They observed adults, mirrored gestures, measured reactions, and learned endurance. Instruction was implicit: speak only when necessary, observe always, endure without complaint, and let the ritual shape you before you are aware of it. By adulthood, deviation felt unnatural. Compliance was instinct. Even when Rome fell politically, these instincts survived. They survived in provincial courts, in monasteries, in urban marketplaces, wherever social hierarchy demanded recognition. The dinner was no longer the literal act of shared food, but the model for interaction: measured, observed, restrained, and self-enforcing. Slaves, who had once been the most conscious of the ritual's demands, transmitted the subtle lessons forward. Even freed individuals carried the knowledge: anticipate needs, move quietly, maintain composure, enforce unspoken order. The lessons survived the loss of the empire because they existed in human behavior, not in buildings or legislation. Endurance remained central. The dinner had trained people to tolerate discomfort, suppress impulsive reaction, and prioritize continuity over immediate satisfaction. These skills were invisible yet potent. People navigated public life with the same caution, deliberation, and patience that the dinner had instilled. Emotional economy became second nature. Impulse, distraction, and disruption were quietly policed. This slow, imperceptible training explains why Roman methods of social control outlasted political structures. Empire crumbled, hierarchy survived. Laws failed, habits persisted. Memory, internalized over generations, became the strongest vector of power. By the late stages, participation in the dinner was almost automatic. Guests arrived, reclined, consumed minimal wine, observed without visible engagement, and left unchanged outwardly but subtly recalibrated inwardly. The ritual required nothing dramatic, no speeches, no explicit judgments, but its effect was cumulative, profound, and persistent. It molded perception. It refined patience. It normalized vigilance. It taught people to see not only what was presented, but what was absent, what was delayed, and what was implied. Understanding emerged through attention, endurance, and habituation. Knowledge passed without explanation. Even as Rome itself dissolved into fragmented kingdoms and distant memories, these methods endured. Social spaces continued to value control over expression, observation over speech, restraint over impulse. Civilizations that followed may have forgotten the precise origins, but the practice survived, embedded in human behavior. The Roman dinner, once a literal table of food, wine, and hierarchy, had become a template for subtle control, a model of endurance, and a method for sustaining authority invisibly. It persisted not because it was written into law, but because it was rehearsed in bodies, remembered in minds, and reinforced nightly over centuries. Habit had outlived empire. Observation had outlived law. The ritual endured because it no longer needed anyone to enforce it. People had become its instruments. It was not a meal. It was training. And that training outlasted everything else. As the ritual persisted, it created a feedback loop that reinforced itself silently. Behavior informed observation, and observation reinforced behavior. Guests watched each other, corrected themselves, and anticipated corrections in turn. The network of compliance grew exponentially with each generation. One small gesture of restraint echoed across dozens of others, embedding the system deeper into daily life. The true power of the dinner was not in instruction, but in anticipation. People learned to predict not only what others would do, but what the ritual required of them. Anticipation became a survival mechanism. Speak too soon and you risked revealing ignorance. Speak too late and you appeared disengaged. The margin for error narrowed over time, but so did opportunity. Mastery of timing became the mark of competence. Every meal trained endurance. The passage of time became a tool of social calibration. Guests learned to sit, to wait, to absorb stimuli, to regulate reactions. Emotional energy was rationed carefully. Exuberance was a liability. Discomfort was expected, internalized, and endured without outward display. This endurance became habit. And habit became identity. Roman identity, once defined by citizenship, law, and conquest, increasingly became a measure of one's ability to navigate ritual spaces like the dinner table. Competence was no longer political, it was performative. The ritual reinforced hierarchy subtly but relentlessly. Even the smallest gestures signaled status. Who reclined closest to the host? Who received the earliest dish? Whose cup was refilled first? These distinctions were often imperceptible to outsiders, but visible to those trained over decades. Every detail mattered. Every microdecision communicated alignment, loyalty, and value. Guests internalized evaluation. They constantly measured themselves against invisible standards. Every action, no matter how minor, was an exercise in social calibration. Over time, this shaped not only interactions but cognition itself. Decision-making became anticipatory rather than spontaneous. Memory became a guide for behavior, rather than a repository for events. Even when the empire faltered, the ritual's cognitive training remained intact. People carried lessons from centuries of dinners into governance, commerce, and family life. Authority persisted not through law or coercion, but through habituated observation, endurance, and silent compliance. Slaves, too, embodied the persistence of the ritual. Their attentiveness, anticipation, and precise action maintained order without intervention. Even freed slaves internalized these lessons, influencing households and societies long after the original structures dissolved. Their knowledge, transmitted silently, became another vector for cultural continuity. In this way, the Roman dinner outlived its material components. Buildings crumbled. Furniture decayed. Recipes were forgotten. Wine was replaced by local substitutes. But the behavior it trained, self-monitoring, anticipation, endurance, and subtle observation, persisted. It became invisible, almost instinctive, and therefore nearly indestructible. The dinner also shaped perception of time. Duration was irrelevant, the experience of endurance mattered more. Waiting, sitting still, observing, anticipating, these became exercises in temporal discipline. Participants learned to inhabit extended periods of stasis, calibrating attention and emotion over hours without relief. This temporal conditioning had broader implications. Decision-making, conflict management, and social strategy all reflected the same skills: patience, observation, anticipation, and internalized control. The ritual's lessons migrated beyond the table to every aspect of public and private life. Even centuries later, the echoes persisted. The careful monitoring of posture, speech, and timing, the subtle calibration of emotional expression, the internalized expectation of observation, all of these are legacies of the Roman dinner. Modern social rituals, formal gatherings, and even corporate meetings trace faint lines back to this enduring pattern of behavior. The dinner never relied on force. It relied on habit. It relied on endurance. It relied on people becoming the instruments of their own discipline. And this is why it lasted. Even in the absence of empire, law, or explicit authority, the ritual survived because it had been internalized. People trained themselves, unconsciously, over decades, to maintain it. Authority, once embedded in human habit, does not vanish. The Roman dinner, in essence, became immortal, not through architecture, conquest, or literature, but through repetition, endurance, and the quiet shaping of human behavior. Over time, the Roman dinner evolved into something almost abstract. The original intent, to train, to observe, to reinforce hierarchy, was no longer consciously understood by most participants. Yet the form persisted, almost by instinct. Guests arrived, reclined, waited, observed, and endured. Each movement, each gesture, carried the weight of centuries of practice. This abstraction made the ritual more powerful. Without explicit meaning, participants filled the void with their own interpretation. They assumed significance where none had been declared. Compliance became self-reinforcing. Because the ritual felt important, people behaved as if it was. Authority migrated from external enforcement to internal conviction. Even the absence of an audience failed to dissolve the ritual. People trained by centuries of dinner behavior performed the gestures alone, anticipating observation even when none was present. Their bodies remembered. Their minds remembered. The performance became inseparable from identity. This invisible power extended beyond social gatherings. Work, governance, family life, and personal conduct all reflected the lessons of the table. Patience, observation, self-restraint, and anticipation of consequence were applied universally. Emotional control, once practiced at meals, became a default mode. Impulse was checked automatically. Decisions were filtered through internalized hierarchy. Every household that maintained these rituals acted as a microcosm of social order. Even when external authority weakened, the internalized rules maintained stability. The ritual became a scaffolding upon which the rest of life was constructed. Slaves and servants remained crucial, though often invisible. Their anticipation, discretion, and adherence to routine sustained the system. Even minor missteps could ripple outward, subtly recalibrating the behaviors of guests. They were both participants and instruments, silently enforcing the expectations embedded in the ritual. As generations passed, the ritual adapted to circumstances but retained its core functions. Foods changed. Spaces shifted. Wine replaced by water. Seats rearranged. Yet the underlying structure, observation, endurance, hierarchy, and performance, remained intact. The dinner also shaped perception of risk. People learned to anticipate consequences for minor actions. Speaking out of turn, expressing enthusiasm, or deviating from expectation could result in exclusion or subtle judgment. These lessons generalized into broader society. Risk management became psychological rather than codified. People navigated social life with the same caution and calculation honed at the table. Even in decline, when material grandeur faded, the ritual maintained cohesion. Smaller gatherings, simpler meals, and fewer guests could still produce the same psychological effects. The content mattered less than the form. Control, observation, and endurance were encoded in the sequence, not the specifics. By the late stages of the empire, the dinner had achieved near total autonomy. Behavior sustained itself. Guests monitored themselves and each other. Hosts intervened less. Silence carried authority. Attention carried authority. Presence carried authority. Authority had become a distributed, self-reinforcing network. This network persisted beyond the fall of political structures. Successor cultures inherited fragments, formal dining practices, codes of etiquette, courtly behavior, and hierarchical observation. The form outlived its context because it had been internalized by human behavior. In essence, the Roman dinner became a machine of culture, a device that shaped identity, perception, and interaction without explicit commands. It relied on repetition, endurance, and anticipation. It transmitted knowledge silently across generations. It created citizens and slaves who understood hierarchy intuitively, without instruction. And when the empire faded, the ritual persisted. Not as Rome itself, but as the echoes of behavior it had trained into human bodies and minds. Power, once internalized, endures beyond the structures that created it. The dinner taught this lesson more effectively than any law, weapon, or throne that it taught the empire how to survive within people. By the time the empire was reduced to fragments, the dinner had become almost entirely self-sustaining. Its original symbols, the dishes, the wine, the seating, had faded into memory, yet the patterns remained. People acted correctly because acting correctly had been trained into muscle and mind. Behavior was no longer conscious, it was instinctual. This instinct shaped identity in ways political structures never could. Being Roman became less about citizenship or law and more about endurance, observation, and self-regulation. People measured themselves not against statutes or governors but against centuries of ritualized expectation. Those who failed to anticipate, to wait, to restrain themselves, revealed weakness, inattention, or inexperience. These were subtle failures, invisible to outsiders, yet instantly recognized by those initiated into the practice. The table, even in memory, served as a mirror. Guests saw themselves reflected in others' behavior and adjusted accordingly. Every gesture, every shift of posture, every pause carried meaning. This feedback loop reinforced conformity, hierarchy, and internalized authority. Deviance was punished not through law or violence, but through exclusion, subtle judgment, or loss of inclusion in future gatherings. Even freed slaves or outsiders adopted these behaviors over time, because the ritual had trained society itself. Anticipation, patience, and endurance became cultural norms. The dinner no longer required enforcement. The culture enforced itself. Silence became as meaningful as speech. Pauses were interpreted. Gestures were amplified. Waiting became a skill, an art, and a necessity. People learned to read each other with extraordinary precision. Every action, no matter how small, communicated alignment or dissonance. The dinner also trained emotional regulation. Guests learned to compress feelings into subtle, controlled expressions. Enthusiasm was dangerous. Discomfort was expected. Excess, either in speech or in gesture, was immediately corrected through observation and social pressure. Over centuries, this produced a population skilled at containing internal states while performing compliance externally. This psychological discipline extended into other arenas. Governance, commerce, public debate, and even personal relationships mirrored the lessons of the table. Patience, observation, anticipation of consequence, and self-restraint became default strategies for navigating life. Even as Rome itself faded, the ritual persisted because it had been internalized. Political power could vanish, orders could collapse, but the habits encoded in bodies and minds endured. They survived in private homes, provincial towns, and even emerging successor states. The dinner had trained people to survive without explicit direction. To perform without instruction. To maintain hierarchy without enforcement. Authority had become internalized, distributed, and self-sustaining. Over centuries, the ritual became abstract. Dishes, wine, and seats mattered less than the form itself: endurance, observation, anticipation, and compliance. Even when the empire's memory dimmed, these behaviors persisted. They became invisible architecture, shaping social life silently. New generations, unfamiliar with the original purpose, performed the ritual instinctively. Its effect remained. Identity, perception, and social order were molded in ways that no law, document, or official could replicate. Habit had become the primary instrument of culture. It required no speeches. No punishment. No formal instruction. Observation, repetition, and endurance were enough. Through this, the dinner transcended the empire. It outlived Rome's collapse, its armies, its governors, its laws, and its cities. It persisted in human behavior, in instinct, in the silent expectation of correctness. Power, when embedded in behavior rather than structure, cannot be destroyed. The Roman dinner, once a table of food and ritual, had become a template for civilization itself: endurance over impulse, observation over speech, habit over law, instinct over instruction. It endured because people had become the vessel of its authority. The empire could crumble. The wine could sour. The dishes could break. But the lesson, silent and internalized, continued. Humans carried the empire in their posture, their restraint, their anticipation, their observation, and their enduring habit. As time stretched forward, the dinner became less about individuals and more about the network of behavior it produced. Each participant was both observer and observed, instructor and student. Every subtle adjustment in posture, every controlled gesture, every delayed reaction reinforced the invisible architecture of social order. The ritual functioned as a quiet machine, shaping cognition and perception. Guests learned to process subtle cues before events fully unfolded. Anticipation became reflexive. Judgment was exercised in microseconds, often without conscious thought. The human mind, trained over generations, internalized centuries of silent instruction. This anticipation extended beyond the table. Markets, tribunals, households, and public spaces became arenas where the same skills, endurance, observation, patience, and self-regulation, applied. Even in chaos, participants behaved with calibrated restraint. Actions were filtered through internalized hierarchy. Decisions were weighed in terms of consequence, alignment, and perception. Over centuries, the ritual's effects multiplied. One person's subtle compliance influenced another, whose response shaped a third, creating cascading patterns of behavior. The network grew denser with each iteration, forming a social fabric as powerful as any law or military force. Even when the empire's political authority dissolved, this fabric remained intact. Citizens of successor states continued to navigate life through learned patterns of observation and endurance. Public gatherings mirrored the silent expectations of the table. Privilege and inclusion were granted not by law but by performance. Behavior maintained order. The ritual also trained emotional control. Exuberance, impatience, or visible discomfort were restrained by centuries of practice. Over time, people experienced emotion not as raw energy but as calibrated signals to be expressed only in socially sanctioned ways. This discipline became instinctual. Feeling and action were decoupled. Reaction was deferred. Restraint became second nature. Even subtle deviations were corrected silently. A pause too long, a glance too bold, a smile too wide, each triggered adjustments from others. The system maintained equilibrium without explicit enforcement. Guests monitored themselves as rigorously as they monitored others. Self-regulation became internalized authority. By the late stages of the ritual's spread, its participants often no longer recognized its origin. The meaning of the dinner had faded, but the behavior persisted. People adhered to its forms automatically. Compliance was instinctive. Observation was reflexive. Patience, endurance, and anticipation were internalized. The table had become a template for social life itself. This abstraction made the ritual more resilient. Even without wine, dishes, or seating, the behaviors remained. Every formal gathering, every court, every ceremony echoed its lessons. Habit had become culture, and culture carried authority. Slaves, freed or otherwise, perpetuated these behaviors in subtle ways. Their anticipation, discretion, and precision ensured continuity. Even minor errors could propagate, requiring correction, but the system adjusted. It learned. It persisted. It endured. The dinner also conditioned perception of time. Guests experienced hours not as moments but as a continuum of endurance. Waiting, observing, and regulating became exercises in temporal discipline. The mind adapted to long periods of structured inactivity. Impulse was suppressed. Anticipation became a dominant mode of awareness. This temporal training extended beyond the meal. It shaped how people governed, negotiated, and managed conflict. Patience and foresight, learned at the table, became tools of power. Endurance became both a personal virtue and a societal necessity. Even when material circumstances changed, food, wine, seating, the underlying effects remained. Behavior outlasted context. Ritual survived empire. Form outlasted substance. By embedding authority in habit, the dinner ensured continuity without coercion. Guests regulated themselves. Observed themselves. Enforced compliance invisibly. Power became distributed, internalized, and almost impossible to remove. The Roman dinner demonstrated the subtle mechanics of cultural survival. It showed how repetition, observation, and endurance can transmit authority across generations. It created citizens and servants who internalized social order without instruction. It ensured continuity even when empires failed, and it endures still, quietly, invisibly, in the patterns of human behavior wherever hierarchy, observation, and endurance are valued. It was never merely a meal. It was civilization encoded in gesture, posture, silence, and endurance. The empire fell. Buildings crumbled. Wine soured. Dishes broke. But the ritual, internalized in bodies and minds, carried forward. Power, when embedded in behavior, is almost immortal. As centuries passed, the dinner became less about individual participants and more about the invisible structure it enforced. Each gesture, each pause, each measured reaction reinforced centuries of tradition. Even minor deviations from expected behavior were corrected instantly, not through words, but through subtle shifts in attention, posture, or placement of objects. The ritual became a living, self-regulating system. The architecture of control extended beyond the meal. Houses were arranged to maximize visibility and observation. Lighting, seating, and movement were all calibrated to support social regulation. People learned to navigate these spaces intuitively, understanding hierarchy and expectation without instruction. The table had taught them to read context, anticipate consequence, and regulate themselves accordingly. Patience, endurance, and anticipation became universal skills. The table trained more than the body, it trained perception. Guests learned to measure time not in minutes or hours, but in subtle shifts of attention and gesture. The passing of a dish, the tilt of a cup, the exchange of a glance, all communicated volumes. Learning to interpret these cues was essential to survival, acceptance, and success. Even absent the physical meal, the patterns persisted. Public gatherings, markets, courts, and family interactions mirrored the same behavioral economy. Observation replaced conversation, subtle gesture replaced command, endurance replaced impulse. Control had migrated inward, becoming instinctive. Participants policed themselves. Behavior maintained hierarchy without enforcement. Authority had become distributed, invisible, and self-sustaining. The ritual also shaped emotional regulation. Guests learned to suppress impulsive reactions, to mask discomfort, and to modulate expression with precision. Exuberance was dangerous, restraint was rewarded. Over generations, this produced a population capable of maintaining composure under stress, calibrated to social expectation, and trained to prioritize the collective pattern over individual desire. Even the freed slaves carried these lessons forward. Their attention to detail, anticipation of need, and adherence to expectation ensured continuity of the ritual across households, cities, and generations. The lessons of the table were embedded in human behavior, independent of social status or political authority. The dinner also reinforced perception of causality. Actions were linked to consequences, often subtly, often retrospectively. Guests learned that gestures mattered, that anticipation was required, and that survival depended on accuracy of perception. Even minor missteps could propagate ripples across social networks, recalibrating the behavior of multiple participants. As the empire weakened, the ritual endured. Buildings decayed, laws vanished, armies disbanded, yet the internalized patterns persisted. Identity, perception, and social order were maintained through habit, observation, and endurance alone. Civilization had migrated from external structures into the bodies and minds of its participants. This persistence created a feedback loop. Behavior shaped observation, observation reinforced behavior, and the pattern reproduced itself. Deviance was corrected silently, compliance became instinctual. Even without conscious knowledge of its purpose, participants performed correctly. The ritual outlived comprehension because it had been internalized, time itself became part of the training. Guests learned to endure hours of attention without relief, to calibrate responses across extended sequences of events, to anticipate interactions before they occurred. Temporal discipline, like emotional and social discipline, became instinctive. The mind was trained to navigate sequences, assess risk, and maintain composure over prolonged periods. The ritual's reach extended far beyond the dinner. Governance, commerce, public interaction, and personal relationships all reflected the same principles: endurance, observation, anticipation, and controlled response. Authority persisted not because it was codified, but because it was embedded in human habit. Even as material and political structures faded, the behavior persisted. The table had encoded hierarchy, social expectation, and endurance into human cognition. Power had become internalized. Compliance had become instinct. Observation had become second nature. The ritual had become civilization itself. The Roman dinner, once a literal meal of food, wine, and ceremony, had transformed into a template for human behavior, subtle, persistent, and self-reinforcing. It demonstrated how authority, once internalized, can outlive empires, laws, and monuments. It survived because humans had become its instruments, carrying it forward without instruction, without enforcement, without awareness of its origin. Habit had become culture. Behavior had become power. And in this way, the dinner endured, quietly, invisibly, almost infinitely, over centuries. The ritual became almost entirely autonomous. Its participants rarely questioned its purpose. The gestures, pauses, and sequences that once carried explicit meaning now functioned purely as habit. People acted correctly because they had learned to, not because they understood why. Instruction was no longer necessary, compliance had become instinct. This instinct shaped society far beyond the dinner table. Public behavior, governance, trade, and family life all reflected the same principles: measured action, anticipation of consequence, and endurance over impulse. Social order persisted not through law or force, but through the internalized discipline of generations. Observation became second nature. Guests constantly monitored themselves and each other. Every glance, posture, and subtle gesture was interpreted for alignment with expectation. Deviations were corrected silently through social feedback, often before the participant was even aware of the misstep. The ritual had become a self-regulating system. Even absence did not break the system. Participants performed as if observed, anticipating judgment even when no one was watching. The table had trained minds and bodies to act correctly in the presence or absence of others. Authority had been internalized. Power had become distributed and self-sustaining. Emotional control became paramount. Expression was carefully modulated. Enthusiasm, distress, or impatience could signal weakness. Restraint was rewarded. Over generations, this produced a population skilled in the management of self, capable of maintaining composure under stress, and conditioned to prioritize societal expectation over personal desire. The ritual also trained memory and perception. Guests learned to recall past interactions, subtle shifts in gesture, and sequences of events to guide future behavior. The table created living archives of experience, embedded in human cognition, shaping decisions long after the meal had ended. Even when material trappings disappeared, wine, food, seating, the lessons endured. The form persisted, independent of content. Habit had become authority. Observation had become governance. Endurance had become civilization. The ritual's effect on time perception was profound. Guests learned to measure hours not by clocks but by shifts in posture, movement of objects, and the cadence of attention. Patience became instinctive. Waiting, observing, and endurance became skills honed unconsciously over generations. Temporal discipline transferred seamlessly into public life, decision-making, and strategy. Slaves, servants, and even freed individuals perpetuated the system. Their precise movements, anticipation, and discretion maintained continuity. They became both observers and enforcers, silently transmitting the lessons of the table. Knowledge no longer depended on authority, it depended on participation. By embedding authority in behavior, the ritual survived the collapse of empire. Laws faded. Cities fell. Armies dissolved. Yet the patterns persisted, internalized within human behavior. Compliance was instinctive, observation reflexive, endurance automatic. The table had transformed participants into vessels of civilization. Even centuries later, echoes remained. Formal gatherings, courtly rituals, hierarchical interactions, all carried the imprint of the dinner's discipline. The principles of endurance, anticipation, observation, and controlled expression persisted in social life, long after the empire itself vanished. The Roman dinner had transcended its origin. It was no longer merely a meal, it had become a template for behavior, identity, and social cohesion. Power, once internalized through habit, cannot be destroyed. It survives silently, invisibly, and persistently, carried forward by human bodies and minds. The empire fell. Cities crumbled. Wine soured. Furniture decayed. But the lessons of the table endured, imperceptibly guiding behavior, maintaining hierarchy, and sustaining civilization itself. It was never about the food. It was always about the human mind. With each passing generation, the ritual became more abstract, yet more powerful. Participants no longer needed explanation or instruction, they had internalized the lessons of endurance, observation, and anticipation. The gestures, pauses, and subtle cues were executed automatically, as if encoded in muscle and memory. This internalization allowed society to function independently of external authority. Laws could be ignored, governors could vanish, armies could disband, and yet order persisted. Social hierarchy was maintained not through coercion, but through behavior. People regulated themselves and each other instinctively. The dinner had trained minds to enforce structure without explicit command. Observation remained central. Guests learned to read subtle shifts in posture, glances, and movement. Timing became crucial. Anticipating another's action or reaction ensured harmony. Deviations were corrected before they could disrupt the ritual, and even minor mistakes were silently remembered and adjusted for in the future. Every participant became both student and teacher, perpetuating the system endlessly. Emotional restraint became instinctive. Expression was carefully measured. Impatience, excitement, or agitation were dangerous signals. By contrast, calm endurance and subtle attentiveness were rewarded. Over centuries, this shaped cognition as profoundly as behavior. Emotional regulation, patience, and strategic observation became second nature. The ritual also trained perception of consequence. Actions were linked to subtle, often invisible outcomes. Participants learned that small gestures could ripple outward, influencing others' behavior. The table had become a classroom of social physics, a space where cause and effect were embedded in habit rather than spoken instruction. Even when material elements, the food, the wine, the seating, vanished, the underlying patterns persisted. The ritual's essence was behavior itself. Habit had become authority. Observation had become governance. Endurance had become civilization. Time, too, was shaped by the ritual. Hours were experienced as sequences of measured attention and controlled interaction. Waiting, observing, and enduring became exercises in temporal mastery. Temporal discipline, honed at the table, generalized to other areas of life, governance, commerce, family, and strategy. Slaves, servants, and attendants maintained continuity. Their anticipation, discretion, and precise execution reinforced the ritual for everyone present. Even freed individuals carried these patterns forward, embedding them into the social fabric. Knowledge no longer depended on law, it depended on participation and repetition. The ritual's self-reinforcing nature ensured persistence. Behavior shaped observation, observation reinforced behavior, and the cycle reproduced itself endlessly. Deviance was corrected silently, compliance became instinctual. Even without understanding its origin, participants performed correctly. The ritual outlived comprehension because it had been internalized. As Rome faded into memory, the ritual's influence expanded. Social gatherings, ceremonial events, and hierarchical interactions all echoed the lessons of the table. Endurance, anticipation, observation, and self-regulation became cultural norms, ingrained in bodies and minds. The Roman dinner had become more than a meal. It had become a template for civilization, invisible, persistent, and self-reinforcing. It demonstrated how power embedded in behavior can survive empires, laws, and monuments. By the time the empire had vanished politically, the table's lessons endured. Authority had migrated into habit, and habit had become culture. Civilization persisted quietly, invisibly, and almost indefinitely. Power, internalized and practiced, cannot be destroyed. The Roman dinner, once food and ceremony, had become a model of enduring human behavior, observation over speech, endurance over impulse, habit over law, instinct over instruction. It endured because humans had become its instruments, carrying it forward unconsciously across centuries. Over centuries, the dinner's influence became so subtle that participants no longer recognized it as a ritual. It was no longer a meal, a social expectation, or a formal event, it had become behavior itself. The patterns of endurance, observation, anticipation, and control were instinctive, embedded in posture, timing, and thought. Participants performed correctly without conscious awareness. This internalization allowed order to persist even as external structures collapsed. Political authority waned, cities decayed, and armies disbanded, yet social cohesion remained. Individuals carried the ritual in their bodies and minds, maintaining hierarchy and expectation without instruction. The ritual had become autonomous. Observation became reflexive. Participants monitored themselves and each other constantly. A glance, a tilt of the head, a subtle shift in posture, all communicated meaning. Deviations were corrected instantly, often before the person themselves was aware. Guests became their own enforcers, silently ensuring compliance and preserving the integrity of the pattern. Emotional discipline was profound. Exuberance, impatience, or overt enthusiasm were suppressed instinctively. Calm endurance, subtle attentiveness, and measured action were cultivated over lifetimes. Emotion was refined into a tool of social survival. Over generations, these habits shaped cognition, creating populations capable of self-regulation and strategic observation. The ritual also trained perception of consequence. Every gesture had meaning. Every delay or acceleration, every pause or glance, rippled outward. Participants learned to anticipate these effects and adjust behavior proactively. Social cause and effect became embedded in habit, rather than codified in law or decree. Even without physical trappings, food, wine, seating, the ritual persisted. Behavior had become the vessel of the pattern. Habit was authority. Observation was governance. Endurance was civilization. The table no longer needed to exist. Its lessons were performed in streets, homes, markets, and courts. Temporal discipline, honed at the dinner, extended into every aspect of life. Hours were navigated with patience and foresight. Waiting, enduring, observing, and anticipating became instinctive, forming the foundation for decision-making, negotiation, and social interaction. Participants were trained to inhabit long stretches of structured attention, an invisible preparation for every challenge they might face. Servants, slaves, and even freed individuals ensured continuity. Their precision, discretion, and anticipation reinforced the ritual for all participants. Knowledge no longer depended on formal instruction or authority, it depended on participation and repetition. The cycle self-perpetuated. The system became self-reinforcing. Behavior shaped observation, observation reinforced behavior, and the cycle multiplied across individuals and generations. Deviance was corrected silently. Compliance became instinct. Authority became internalized. Power migrated from buildings, armies, and law into human habit. By the time Rome itself had vanished politically, the ritual had already transcended material and political existence. Its lessons endured, embedded in gesture, posture, timing, and perception. Formal gatherings, courtly etiquette, and hierarchical interactions all reflected its influence. Civilization itself carried the imprint of the table. Long after the empire disappeared, the Roman dinner had become a model of social continuity and human behavior. Observation over speech, endurance over impulse, habit over law, instinct over instruction. The ritual had outlived its empire, its buildings, its wine, and its hosts. It endured because people had become the instruments of its authority. Civilization survived, not in monuments or armies, but in bodies, minds, and silent, enduring habits. As the centuries progressed, the dinner's influence became entirely embedded in social intuition. The ritual's original forms, food, wine, seating, and ceremony, were no longer necessary. Behavior itself carried the lessons. Endurance, anticipation, observation, and control were performed automatically. Participants executed these actions without awareness of their origin, yet they reinforced hierarchy and social order with perfect fidelity. This internalized discipline allowed human society to function independently of formal authority. Laws could vanish. Cities could decay. Rulers could fall. And yet, order persisted. People regulated themselves and each other instinctively, performing the ritual's lessons as if they were second nature. Authority had migrated from external structures to the internalized habits of individuals. Observation became a constant, unconscious process. Glances, posture, timing, and gestures carried nuanced meaning. Deviations were corrected before they could destabilize the system. Participants became both enforcers and students, maintaining continuity through silent coordination. The ritual had transformed into a self-regulating network of behavior, invisible but powerful. Emotional regulation was an unspoken requirement. Expression of impatience, excitement, or distress was suppressed instinctively. Calm endurance, measured attention, and disciplined behavior became instinctual. Emotional states were refined into instruments of social survival, not expressions of self. Over generations, this shaped cognition, producing populations capable of strategic thought, patience, and long-term social awareness. The ritual also conditioned perception of consequence. Minor actions could ripple outward, influencing behavior across the social network. Participants learned to anticipate these effects, internalizing cause-and-effect relationships without explicit instruction. Social intelligence became instinctive, encoded in body and mind. Even in the absence of material ritual, the wine, the food, the seating, the behaviors endured. The table had become symbolic only, the essence persisted in habit. Observation replaced enforcement, endurance replaced law, and structured behavior became civilization itself. People carried the empire within their bodies and minds, perpetuating social order in absence of rulers or armies. Temporal perception was also transformed. Hours were experienced as extended sequences of controlled attention. Participants learned to endure long periods of observation, suppress impulses, and anticipate outcomes. Patience, endurance, and timing became essential cognitive tools. This temporal discipline extended beyond ritual to all aspects of social life, governance, negotiation, commerce, and family. Servants and slaves, through their anticipatory precision and compliance, ensured the system's continuity. Even freed individuals carried these patterns forward, embedding them in households and communities. The network of behavior became self-sustaining, independent of any central authority. The dinner produced a self-reinforcing cycle. Behavior informed observation, observation reinforced behavior, and the pattern propagated across generations. Deviance was corrected silently, compliance became instinctual. Authority, embedded in habit, became indestructible. Power had migrated from law and force to the internalized discipline of human action. By the time Rome as a political entity vanished, the ritual's influence had already transcended its physical and historical origins. Its lessons endured invisibly in gesture, posture, and anticipation. Formal gatherings, social hierarchies, and interpersonal etiquette were all informed by patterns established centuries earlier. Civilization itself carried the imprint of the table. The Roman dinner had become more than a meal or a ritual, it was a template for human behavior. Observation over speech, endurance over impulse, habit over law, instinct over instruction. Its power persisted because it was internalized. Humans had become the vessels of civilization, sustaining order through silent, persistent habit. Even as time moved forward, empire faded, and cities crumbled, the ritual endured. It endured in bodies, in minds, and in the subtle orchestration of human behavior. Civilization survived, not in monuments or armies, but in the quiet endurance of habit, anticipation, and observation. As time stretched onward, the dinner's influence spread beyond private homes into public life. Its lessons, endurance, observation, anticipation, and restraint, had been internalized so thoroughly that every social interaction echoed the ritual. Marketplaces, courts, forums, and streets became extensions of the table. The principles of behavior trained over centuries guided actions unconsciously: who spoke when, how gestures were made, how attention was divided. Observation became constant and reflexive. People scanned faces, posture, and subtle shifts in movement automatically. Each small gesture communicated alignment, defiance, or understanding. Deviations were corrected silently through social cues, often before the individual realized their misstep. Each participant, knowingly or not, enforced the ritual structure in themselves and in others. Emotional discipline persisted. Exuberance, impatience, or overt excitement were instinctively suppressed. Calm endurance, subtle attention, and controlled action became the default. Feelings were measured and mediated through habit. Over generations, this shaped not just behavior but cognition, producing minds adept at anticipating consequences, navigating social hierarchies, and enduring discomfort. Time itself was shaped by these patterns. Hours were experienced as sequences of structured observation, waiting, and reaction. Patience became instinct. Endurance became skill. Temporal awareness was sharpened, not by clocks, but by careful attention to social cues and anticipated events. Participants learned to manage long stretches of focused attention, a preparation for every social or civic challenge. Even as empires fell, buildings crumbled, and cities vanished, the behaviors persisted. The rituals had become autonomous. Habit replaced authority. Observation replaced law. Endurance replaced governance. Civilization had migrated from structures into human minds and bodies. People carried order within themselves, maintaining continuity without rulers or armies. Slaves, servants, and attendants ensured the transmission of the ritual. Their anticipatory precision, discretion, and compliance perpetuated the structure across households and communities. Even freed individuals carried these lessons forward, embedding the patterns of behavior in every corner of society. Knowledge and authority no longer depended on law, they depended on participation, repetition, and observation. The system became self-reinforcing. Behavior shaped observation, observation reinforced behavior, and the pattern replicated across generations. Deviance was corrected silently. Compliance became instinctual. Power had migrated from material and political structures into internalized habit, distributed across the population. Authority had become permanent because it resided in human behavior. By the time Rome ceased to exist as a political entity, the ritual's lessons endured invisibly. Formal gatherings, ceremonial events, social hierarchies, and interpersonal etiquette all reflected the influence of the table. Endurance, anticipation, observation, and restraint had become cultural norms, ingrained in bodies and minds. Civilization itself carried the imprint of the Roman dinner. The meal had transcended its origin. It was no longer about food, wine, or seating. It had become a mechanism for transmitting order, hierarchy, and social intelligence silently, imperceptibly, across generations. Power embedded in behavior is indestructible, because it exists in every individual who performs it, consciously or unconsciously. Even centuries later, echoes of the ritual persisted. Humans continued to navigate society with the instincts it had trained, anticipating consequences, enduring discomfort, observing others, and restraining impulse. Civilization survived, not in monuments or armies, but in the silent practice of habit, repeated endlessly and internalized deeply. The Roman dinner had become eternal. Not as a table, a ritual, or even a memory, but as a living framework of human behavior, endurance over impulse, observation over speech, habit over law, instinct over instruction. It persisted because humans carried it in themselves. Civilization survived in posture, in anticipation, in subtle gestures, in patience, and in endurance. The empire could crumble, the cities could decay, the wine could sour, and the tables could vanish, but the patterns, once internalized, could never truly be destroyed. Order had become invisible. Authority had become instinct. Civilization had become habit. The table was eternal, over generations, the ritual's influence became fully unconscious. Participants no longer remembered its origin, they acted correctly because habit demanded it. The gestures, pauses, glances, and careful timing that once carried explicit meaning had become instinctive. Behavior itself transmitted the rules, expectations, and hierarchy. Civilization had been encoded into human action.